I'd frozen in the cereal aisle when the boy ran past me, his voice cutting through the grocery store's background noise like a bell. "Dad, wait." The word had stopped me mid-reach. Not unusual, fathers and sons shopped here all the time. But something about the voice had made me turn. The man at the end of the aisle had turned too. Tall. Dark hair going gray at the temples, the way he'd shifted his weight, favoring his left leg slightly. My basket had slipped from my hand. Cans rolled across the floor. The man had looked in my direction briefly, then turned back to the boy. "Benton, don't run. We talked about this." That voice, the exact cadence, the patient firmness. I'd stood there, cereal boxes at my feet, people moving around me, while my brain tried to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew to be true. Rowan Winslow had died 10 years ago, killed in action overseas. I'd attended his memorial service, accepted the folded flag, rebuilt my entire life around his absence. But the man walking away with that boy had Rowan's shoulders. Rowan's walk. Rowan's voice. The boy had laughed, a bright, unself-conscious sound, and grabbed the man's hand. "Sorry, Dad. I forgot." The man had ruffled the boy's hair, a gesture so familiar it had made my chest tighten. Rowan used to do that, exactly like that. I'd watched them move toward the checkout lanes, the boy chattering about something. The man listening with that same half-smile Rowan used to wear when he was tired but present. An employee had appeared beside me. "Ma'am, are you all right?" I'd nodded automatically. "Fine. Just dropped something." She'd helped me pick up the cans. I'd thanked her, put them back in my basket mechanically. By the time I'd looked up again, the man and boy were gone. I'd left my basket in the aisle and walked out. Didn't remember getting to my car. Just found myself sitting in the driver's seat, hands shaking, staring at the steering wheel. Trauma plays tricks. I knew that. 10 years of grief counseling had taught me that much. The mind sees what it expects to see. Creates patterns, finds familiar faces in crowds. But my body knew something my mind was trying to dismiss. That had been Rowan. I'd driven home on autopilot, parked in my driveway, sat in the car for 20 minutes before going inside. The house was quiet. It was always quiet. I'd built a life that functioned well in silence. I'd made tea I didn't drink, stood at the kitchen window watching nothing. Tried to convince myself I'd imagined it. Coincidence. Resemblance. A stranger who happened to have Rowan's build and mannerisms and voice. The world was full of people. Some of them were bound to look alike, but the boy had called him Dad, had grabbed his hand with the easy familiarity of a child who'd known that man his whole life. 10 years. The boy had looked about 10 years old. I'd set down my teacup carefully, hands still trembling. No, impossible. Rowan had died in 2014. The Army had confirmed it. I'd received official notification, spoken to his commanding officer, held his folded flag while they'd played taps. Dead soldiers don't shop at grocery stores with 10-year-old sons, but my body still remembered how he'd stood, how he'd moved, how he'd sounded. And memory, I'd learned, was harder to dismiss than logic. That night, I'd opened the old Army folder I kept in the filing cabinet, the one marked Rowan Winslow, KIA. I hadn't looked at it in years, hadn't needed to. The contents were seared into my memory. Official notification letter, death certificate, casualty report, memorial service program, flag presentation certificate, all the paperwork that transforms a living person into a closed file. I'd read the casualty report again. Killed in action during hostile engagement. Remains recovered and identified through dental records and personal effects. Recovered, identified, confirmed. I'd received his personal effects months later. Dog tags, wedding ring, watch with a cracked crystal. Everything had been real, official, verified through proper channels. Except now I'd seen a man in a grocery store who'd moved like Rowan, sounded like Rowan, had the same patient way of correcting a child that Rowan would have had. I'd closed the folder carefully, put it back in the cabinet. Trauma plays tricks, I'd reminded myself again. But I'd also learned something else in 10 years. Trust your instincts. When something feels wrong, it usually is. I just hadn't decided yet which felt more wrong, believing Rowan was alive or believing I was losing my mind. I'd spent the next day trying to function normally. Work, errands, the routines I'd built to give structure to a life that had fallen apart and been carefully reassembled. I'd become someone after Rowan's death. Someone stable, careful. Someone who honored his memory by living well, not just surviving. I'd gone back to school, finished my degree, built a career in medical records, detail-oriented work that required precision and left no room for uncertainty. I'd learned to be alone without being lonely, to make decisions without consulting anyone, to build a life that was mine rather than ours. I'd dated occasionally. Nothing serious. No one who made me want to rearrange my carefully ordered existence. Friends told me I was strong, resilient, an inspiration. I'd accepted the compliments and never mentioned how much of that strength came from having no other choice. You either rebuild or you break. I'd chosen rebuilding. But now, sitting at my desk, pretending to review medical charts, I couldn't stop thinking about the man in the grocery store. The way he'd turned when the boy called him Dad. The slight limp, the gray at his temples, the patience in his voice. All of it familiar. All of it impossible. I'd built my life on Rowan's death. On the truth the army had given me. On the certainty that he was gone. What happened to that life if the truth was different? I'd gone back to the grocery store the next day. Same time, early evening, after work. Same section, cereal aisle where I'd dropped my basket. I'd told myself I was just shopping, that I needed groceries anyway. That returning to the scene of an unsettling coincidence wasn't obsessive, just practical. I'd positioned myself near the produce section with a clear view of the entrance. Picked through apples I didn't want. Watched every person who came through the automatic doors. 20 minutes passed. 30. I'd started to feel foolish. Then they'd walked in, the man and the boy, same time as before. Apparently a routine. I'd moved quickly, keeping distance, watching from behind a display of canned goods. The boy had grabbed a cart. The man had guided him with one hand on his shoulder. They'd moved through the store with the easy rhythm of people who'd done this together many times. I'd followed, not closely, just close enough to observe. The man had reached for items on high shelves. The boy had asked questions. Could they get the sugary cereal? Could they have ice cream for dessert? Normal. Domestic. A father and son, doing weekly shopping. Except that father was supposed to be dead. I'd stayed 3 aisles back, watching through gaps in the shelving. The boy had grabbed something off a lower shelf, laughing about a cartoon character on the package. Dad, look, it's the one from the show. The man had examined it with exaggerated seriousness. Is this nutritionally sound? Dad, the boy had groaned, the universal sound of children subjected to parental responsibility. All right, 1 box, but we're also getting the boring cereal. Deal. They'd moved on, I'd followed. The man had asked the boy about school. The boy had complained about a math test. The man had offered to help him study. Their conversation was easy, lived in. The kind of rapport that doesn't develop overnight. This wasn't a new relationship. This was years of accumulated moments, daily interactions. A father who'd been present for school days and math tests and cartoon cereal negotiations. 10 years of moments I'd believed Rowan had been dead for. I'd stopped following at the dairy section, suddenly overwhelmed. This wasn't coincidence, wasn't resemblance, wasn't my mind playing tricks. That was Rowan. Living, parenting, grocery shopping, while I'd spent a decade grieving someone who apparently hadn't died at all. I'd watched them at the checkout lane. The man had handed the boy money to pay, teaching moment, letting him handle the transaction. The boy had counted bills carefully. The cashier had smiled at him, patient and encouraging. And then the man had reached to adjust his sleeve, and I'd seen it. A scar on his left wrist, white against tan skin. L-shaped, about 2 inches long. I'd stopped breathing. That scar. I knew that scar. Rowan had gotten it our 2nd year of marriage. Accident with a broken glass while washing dishes, deep enough for stitches. I'd driven him to urgent care. Held his other hand while they'd stitched it closed. 8 stitches. I'd counted them. Teased him about being squeamish. Kissed the bandage afterward. That exact scar was on this man's wrist. Scars don't transfer to strangers, don't appear on doppelgangers by cosmic coincidence. That was Rowan's scar, on Rowan's wrist, on Rowan's body. Which meant this wasn't delusion or resemblance or grief-induced hallucination. This was him, alive, real. Shopping with a child I'd never seen before. My legs had gone weak. I'd gripped a shelf for support. The man and boy had finished checking out. Walked toward the exit. Disappeared into the parking lot. I'd stood there, frozen, while certainty settled over me like ice water. Rowan was alive. I didn't confront him. Didn't run after them. Didn't call out. just walked calmly to the parking lot and watched which car they got into. A gray SUV, Minnesota plates. I'd memorized the license plate, written it down in my phone the moment they'd driven away. Then I'd sat in my car, hands shaking again, trying to process what I knew. Rowan was alive. The scar proved it, the voice proved it. The walk, the mannerisms, the patient correction of the boy, all of it proved it. 10 years. 10 years of believing he was dead. 10 years of grief and rebuilding and moving forward, all based on a lie. But why? Why would the army tell me he was dead if he wasn't? Why would Rowan let me believe it? Why would he build a new life, with a child apparently, while I'd spent a decade mourning him? The questions piled up, unanswerable without more information. I'd started the car, driven home, moved through the evening in a daze, made dinner I didn't eat, tried to watch television I didn't see, went to bed knowing I wouldn't sleep. Rowan was alive. That single fact rewrote everything I'd thought I knew about the past decade. And I had no idea what to do with it. I'd pulled out every photo I had of Rowan that night, spread them across my dining room table, wedding photos, deployment photos, the last pictures before he'd left for what became his final tour. I'd studied his face, his posture, the way he stood, the tilt of his head. Then I'd pulled up the mental image of the man in the grocery store. Older, grayer, different haircut, but the same bone structure, same nose, same eyes, and that scar. The one I'd stitched, the one I'd traced with my finger 1,000 times. I'd found a deployment photo where his wrist was visible, zoomed in on my phone. There. Same scar, same placement, same L shape. No question now, no room for doubt. The man in the grocery store was Rowan Winslow, my legally dead husband who had a son who looked about 10 years old. The timeline had made my stomach turn. Rowan had died in 2014. If the boy was 10 now, he'd been born around 2014. Maybe before. Maybe during Rowan's last deployment. Which meant what? That Rowan had another family? That he'd been living a double life? That his death had been staged to escape? I'd gathered all the photos, put them back in their box, then I'd pulled out the army folder again and read every document with new eyes, looking for inconsistencies, gaps, anything that would explain how a dead man was buying groceries in Minnesota. I'd contacted Major Kellen Bryce the next morning. He'd been Rowan's commanding officer, the one who'd called to notify me of Rowan's death, the one who'd attended the memorial service. His number was still in my phone. I'd never deleted it. Major Bryce, this is Alara Winslow. A pause. Then, Mrs. Winslow, it's been a long time. How can I help you? I need to ask about Rowan's death, about the confirmation process. Another pause, longer this time. Is there a specific concern? I just want to make sure everything was properly documented, for legal purposes. I can assure you that all protocols were followed. The identification was thorough and conclusive. What methods were used? For identification? Dental records and personal effects. The remains were badly damaged, but the evidence was definitive. Was DNA testing conducted? Silence. Then, carefully, I'd have to review the file. But I can tell you with certainty that your husband's death was confirmed through multiple verification points. I'd like to see the complete file, all verification records. Mrs. Winslow, may I ask what's prompting this request? After 10 years. Just due diligence, Major, for closure. I understand. I'll see what I can access. These files are often sealed after a certain period. I'd appreciate whatever you can provide. We'd ended the call politely, professionally. But I'd heard something in his voice, a careful tone, like he was being asked a question he'd hoped wouldn't come. Major Bryce had called back 3 days later. Mrs. Winslow, I've reviewed what's available. The file is complete and sealed according to standard protocols. I'm not authorized to reopen it without substantial cause. What would constitute substantial cause? New evidence, significant discrepancies. Something that would warrant formal investigation. What if I told you I have reason to believe the identification was incorrect? Silence. Long enough that I'd thought the call had dropped. Mrs. Winslow, that's a serious allegation. What evidence are you basing this on? Personal observation, information I've recently become aware of. I need you to be specific. The Army doesn't reopen casualty cases without concrete justification. I'd hesitated. Saying it out loud would make it real, would start something I couldn't stop. I believe Rowan may still be alive. The silence that followed had been different, heavier. Mrs. Winslow, I understand that grief can... I'm not grief-stricken, Major. I'm methodical. I've seen something that doesn't align with what I was told. I'm requesting verification because I have reason to question the original conclusion. What exactly have you seen? I'd prefer not to say until I have more information, but I'm formally requesting access to the death verification records, DNA confirmation, remains transfer documentation. I'll escalate this to the appropriate department, but I want you to understand, these cases are thoroughly investigated. The likelihood of error is extremely low. I understand. I'm just asking for verification. After we'd hung up, I'd felt the first flutter of real fear. What if I was right? What did that mean about everything I'd been told? The call from Army Records came 2 weeks later. A woman named Lieutenant Chen, professional, careful. Mrs. Winslow, I'm calling regarding your request for verification records on Sergeant Rowan Winslow. Yes, what did you find? I've reviewed the file. The death was confirmed through dental records and personal effects recovered from the incident site. What about DNA testing? A pause. DNA testing wasn't conducted in this case. The identification was made through available dental records, which provided conclusive match. Why wasn't DNA testing done? In cases where dental records provide clear identification, DNA testing isn't always necessary, especially in combat zones where resources are limited and recovery conditions are challenging. What about the remains? Where were they transferred? More rustling. The remains were cremated according to military protocol. The ashes were provided to next of kin, that would be you, in 2014. I'd stared at the urn on my mantel, the one I'd been given at the memorial service, the one I'd kept for 10 years. What verification was done before cremation? The identification had already been confirmed through dental records. Cremation followed standard procedure. So no independent DNA verification was ever conducted? As I said, the dental records were deemed conclusive. And if those records were incorrect or misidentified? Lieutenant Chen's voice had become very careful. Mrs. Winslow, are you suggesting the identification was flawed? I'm suggesting it was never independently verified, and that seems like a significant gap. Lieutenant Chen had promised to review the dental record confirmation process. She'd called back 5 days later. Mrs. Winslow, I've consulted with forensic specialists. There appears to be a discrepancy. My heart had stopped. What kind of discrepancy? The dental records used for identification were provided by the field unit. They weren't cross-referenced with Sergeant Winslow's official military dental records until after cremation had been completed. And there are some inconsistencies between the two sets of records. Minor variations that could be explained by documentation errors or field conditions, but they raise questions. They raise questions, she'd confirmed quietly. The identification was based on partial dental records from the field. The complete military records show additional dental work that wasn't reflected in the field documentation. Meaning what? Meaning the identification may have been based on incomplete information. Which doesn't necessarily mean it was wrong, but it does mean it wasn't as conclusive as it should have been. I gripped the phone tighter. What about the personal effects? The dog tags? The wedding ring? Those were recovered from the incident site. They definitively belonged to Sergeant Winslow, but personal effects can be separated from individuals in combat scenarios. Their presence doesn't confirm identity of remains. So what you're telling me is that my husband's death was confirmed based on partial dental records and personal effects that could have been left behind, and nobody verified this independently before cremation. That's an accurate summary of the situation. The Army had closed a story that was never finished. That's what I'd understood sitting there with Lieutenant Chen's careful admissions settling over me. They'd made an identification based on available evidence. Declared Rowan dead, completed the paperwork, closed the file, and nobody had questioned it. Nobody had demanded more thorough verification. Nobody had checked whether the dental records actually matched or whether the personal effects definitively proved death rather than just presence. They told a widow her husband was dead, given her ashes, moved on. What happens now? I'd asked Lieutenant Chen. I'll need to file a formal report about the discrepancy. This will trigger a review of the case. But Mrs. Winslow, I want to be clear. Finding issues with the identification process doesn't mean Sergeant Winslow is alive. It just means the confirmation wasn't as thorough as it should have been. I understand. Do you have any additional information that would support further investigation? I'd hesitated. Then, not yet, but I'm working on it. After the call, I'd sat in my living room staring at the urn. For 10 years, I'd believed those ashes were Rowan, had spoken to them, had built my grief around their presence. Now I didn't know what they were, who they were, whether they represented a person at all or just the Army's need for closure. Everything I'd trusted was unraveling, and I still didn't know why. I'd hired an attorney the next day, not a military lawyer, a civilian specialist in identity verification and fraud. Sloan Merritt, recommended by a colleague, precise, quiet, the kind of person who dealt in facts rather than emotions. I'd laid out everything in her office. The grocery store sighting, the scar, the Army's admission about incomplete verification, the timeline that didn't make sense. Sloan had listened without interrupting, taken notes, asked clarifying questions. What exactly are you hoping to accomplish? I need to know if Rowan is alive. I need proof, one way or the other. And if he is alive, what then? Then I need to understand why, and I need to protect myself legally. Sloan had nodded. First step is confirming identity. You have the license plate number? Yes. We'll start there. Vehicle registration will give us a name and address. If it's registered to Rowan or anyone connected to him, that's our first confirmation. What if it's registered to someone else? Then we investigate that person. See if there's any connection to Rowan, any indication he's living under another identity. How long will this take? Depends on what we find. Could be days, could be weeks. But if Rowan Winslow is alive and living in Minnesota, we'll find the evidence. I'd signed the retainer agreement, authorized her to start the investigation. Sitting in her office, making it official, I'd felt something shift. This wasn't grief or suspicion anymore. This was a case, with evidence and investigation and eventual answers. One way or another, I'd know the truth. Sloan had called me 3 days later. The vehicle is registered to a Garrett Hale. Address in Edina, Minnesota. Purchased new in 2016. Garrett Hale, not Rowan Winslow. Does the name mean anything to you? Sloan had asked. No, I've never heard it. I ran background checks. Garrett Hale has lived in Minnesota since 2015. Before that, no record. It's like he didn't exist until then. A new identity? Possibly. I'm checking for legal name changes. If Rowan Winslow became Garrett Hale through official channels, there'll be documentation. She'd called back the next day. Found it. Rowan Winslow filed for legal name change in Montana in 2017. Changed his name to Garrett Hale. All proper legal channels. Published notice in local paper as required. Everything by the book. 1. 3 years after his death. How is that possible? I'd asked. He was legally declared dead. Death certificates can be challenged and overturned. But there's no record of that happening, which means either the name change was processed without checking death records, or someone deliberately bypassed that verification. So Rowan is alive, living as Garrett Hale. That's what the evidence suggests. I'm still gathering documentation, but yes, it appears Rowan Winslow legally changed his identity 3 years after being declared KIA. I'd sat down, legs suddenly weak. It was real, all of it. Not delusion, not coincidence. Rowan had faked his death and built a new life. Sloan had kept digging. Each day brought new details that made the picture clearer and more devastating. Garrett Hale was married to a woman named Maria Hale, formerly Maria Voss. They'd married in 2016, 2 years after Rowan's death. They had one child, Benton Hale, born in April 2014. I'd stared at that birth date, April 2014. Rowan had died in March 2014, which meant Maria had been pregnant when Rowan had disappeared, had given birth a month after his supposed death. I need you to understand what this timeline suggests, Sloan had said carefully. If Maria was pregnant in early 2014, and Rowan was overseas during most of that period, he knew about the pregnancy before he died, or before he faked his death. That's what the timeline indicates. The calculation was simple and horrible. Rowan had known Maria was pregnant, had known he had a child coming, had staged his death and disappeared, leaving me to grieve, leaving the Army to close his file, leaving behind one life to start another. with a woman who'd been pregnant with his child while he'd still been married to me. What else? I'd asked, voice flat. Financial records show Garrett Hale has no employment history prior to 2016. Then suddenly he's working as an IT consultant, making good money, normal tax returns, everything legitimate. Where did he get the money to start over? To live on for 2 years? That's what I'm still investigating. But there are some concerning patterns. Like what? Like cash deposits that don't match his stated income, like assets that appeared without clear source documentation, like someone who had significant resources before he officially had any legal income. I'd closed my eyes. He stole it. I can't confirm that yet. But I'm looking into it. The timeline had made sickening sense once Sloan laid it all out. Early 2014, Rowan was on deployment. Maria became pregnant. March 2014, Rowan was declared killed in action. Personal effects recovered. Remains identified. April 2014, Benton born. 2015, Garrett Hale appeared in Minnesota. No prior history. Significant resources. 2016, Garrett Hale married Maria Voss. 2017, legal name change from Rowan Winslow to Garrett Hale. Official. Public. Permanent. Rowan hadn't died. He'd escaped. Created a new identity. Waited long enough for his death to be accepted and forgotten. Then formalized the new life he'd been building in secret. With a woman he'd gotten pregnant while still married to me. With resources he'd acquired through means I was starting to understand had probably been illegal. I need to know why, I'd told Sloan. I need to understand what he was running from that was worth all this. I'm working on it. Military records are difficult to access, but I have contacts. If there was an issue during his deployment, financial misconduct, disciplinary action, anything that would motivate this kind of escape, I'll find it. I'd thanked her. Hung up. Sat in my car outside her office. 10 years. 10 years I'd believed Rowan died serving his country. 10 years I'd honored his memory. Told stories about his sacrifice. Accepted condolences. Carried grief I'd thought was earned. All while he'd been alive, building a family, living under a stolen identity, using his supposed death as permission to disappear. Sloan had found it 2 weeks later, called me to her office, laid out documents I recognized from military files. Rowan was under investigation when he disappeared, she'd said without preamble. Financial irregularities during his deployment. Funds that went missing from operational accounts he had access to. I'd stared at the documents. Official military investigation reports dated February 2014. How much? Initial estimate was $280,000. Money meant for local operations, infrastructure payments, contractor fees. It was routed through accounts Rowan managed. Then it disappeared. And nobody noticed until after he died? The investigation was just beginning when he was reported KIA. After his death was confirmed, the investigation was quietly closed. The money was written off as combat losses. The file was sealed. So his death was convenient. His death solved multiple problems. The Army got to close a case that would have been embarrassing if it became public. Rowan got to escape prosecution. Everyone moved on. Except me. Sloan had looked at me with something like sympathy. Except you. I'd read through the investigation file. Saw the timeline of missing funds, the questions that had been raised. The inquiry that had been suspended when the subject died. Rowan hadn't been killed in action. He'd deserted, stolen $250,000 and staged his death to avoid court-martial. And the Army had let him, had marked him KIA, and moved on, rather than admitting they'd lost track of funds and a soldier. What happens now? I'd asked. Now we have enough to force the Army to reopen the case. To formally declare Rowan alive and strip his death certificate. To pursue him for desertion and fraud. And Maria? She's complicit. She had to know who he was, what he'd done. She helped him hide. I'd gathered the documents, evidence of a betrayal that went deeper than I'd imagined. Rowan hadn't just left me. He'd stolen, lied, and let an institution cover for him. And I'd spent 10 years grieving a hero who'd never existed. I'd sat with the knowledge for 3 days before making my decision. Part of me had wanted to confront him, to show up at his door. To demand answers and apologies and some explanation that would make any of this make sense. But that would have been about my needs, my anger, my hurt. And I'd learned over 10 years that rage without strategy just makes noise. So instead, I'd gathered every document, every piece of evidence. every photograph and record and timeline Sloan had compiled, and I'd submitted it all to the Military Investigation Office, with a cover letter that was 2 paragraphs of facts and 1 sentence of request. Please investigate and take appropriate action. No emotional appeal, no personal grievance. Just documentation that a man declared KIA in 2014 was alive and living under an assumed identity in Minnesota. The Army had called within a week. Formal tone, official language. Mrs. Winslow, we've received your submission. This is now an active investigation. We'll need you to provide testimony and any additional documentation you have access to. I've provided everything I have. Anything else will need to come from your own investigation. We appreciate your cooperation. Please be aware that this case is now classified. You cannot discuss it publicly or contact Mr. Winslow directly. I understand. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. After the call, I'd felt something loosen in my chest. Not relief exactly, just the absence of weight. I'd done what I needed to. The truth was now in official hands. What happened next wasn't my responsibility. Sloan had called with the final pieces 3 weeks later. The Army investigation confirmed everything. Rowan deserted in March 2014 with approximately $280,000 in misappropriated operational funds. He staged his death using another soldier's partial remains and his own personal effects. Another soldier's remains? The words had come out faint. A soldier who died in the same incident, badly damaged remains that Rowan claimed as his own. The Army covered it up because acknowledging the misidentification would have raised questions about their verification protocols and the missing money. So they knew. They suspected, but closing the case as KIA was simpler than admitting they'd lost a deserter and $250,000. Rowan took their silence as permission, built a new life, assumed he was safe. And Maria? She knew who he was from the beginning. They'd met before his deployment. She was pregnant when he deserted. They'd planned the whole thing together. She was never his savior. She was his exit strategy. Exit strategy. Clinical language for abandoning one life and stealing another. What happens now? The Army has issued a warrant. Federal charges for desertion and fraud. Local police have been notified. It's just a matter of time before he's arrested. How much time? Could be days, could be hours. They're moving carefully to make sure he doesn't run again. I'd thanked Sloan. Paid her final invoice. Closed the case on my end. The rest would unfold without me. Rowan's carefully constructed life would collapse. Not because of my rage, but because of systems and documentation and the truth finally catching up. Justice didn't need my voice. It just needed the facts. I'd submitted everything without commentary. Just the file. Complete and devastating. The Army had thanked me for my service to truth. Official language for acknowledging that I'd done their job for them. Found the deserter they'd given up looking for. Documented the fraud they'd quietly overlooked. Forced them to confront what they'd hoped would stay buried. They'd reopened Rowan's case officially. Stripped his KIA designation. Issued warrants. Set wheels in motion that couldn't be stopped. I hadn't asked for updates. Hadn't requested notification. Just walked away and let the system do what systems do when given irrefutable evidence. The truth had its own momentum now. It would roll forward, whether I watched or not. I'd gone home, made dinner, lived my normal life. Somewhere in Minnesota, Rowan was living his last days of freedom. Shopping with Benton. Coming home to Maria, pretending his past was dead and buried, not knowing it had just been resurrected. Not knowing his wife, his real wife, the one he'd made a widow, had quietly, methodically destroyed the illusion he'd built. I'd burned the condolence letter that night, the one that had arrived 10 years ago. We regret to inform you. Official notification of a death that had never happened. Watched it curl and blacken in my fireplace. Felt something release that I'd been holding since the grocery store. Not anger. Not grief. Just the end of carrying someone else's lie. The call had come from a number I didn't recognize. An official voice. Professional. Mrs. Winslow? This is Agent Cortez with the Criminal Investigation Division. I wanted to inform you that Garrett Hale, formerly Rowan Winslow, was taken into custody this morning. I'd sat down carefully. Was anyone hurt? No, ma'am. He was stopped during a routine traffic stop. When his identification was run, the warrant appeared. He was arrested without incident. What about the child? A minor was present in the vehicle. Child Protective Services was contacted. The boy was released to his mother after questioning. Benton, 10 years old, watching his father be arrested, not understanding that the man he knew as Dad was someone else entirely to the law. What happens now? Mr. Winslow will be charged federally with desertion and fraud. The investigation is ongoing. You may be contacted for additional testimony. I understand. We wanted you to know you were instrumental in bringing this case to resolution. After the call, I'd sat very still. It was over. The investigation, the uncertainty. The question of whether I'd been imagining things or whether my instincts had been right. Rowan had been arrested. Would face charges. Would lose the life he'd stolen. Not because I'd confronted him. Not because I'd exposed him publicly. Just because truth, once documented, has weight. And that weight had finally landed. The official letter had arrived 6 weeks later. Formal military stationery, legal language. The death record for Sergeant Rowan Winslow has been officially voided. All associated benefits and status are hereby revoked. I'd read it twice. Then filed it with the other documents in the folder marked Rowan Winslow resolved, not KIA anymore. Just resolved. I'd taken down the folded flag from its place on my mantle, the one they'd given me at the memorial service. The symbol of sacrifice and honor and service. It had represented a lie, a convenient fiction that had served everyone except me. I'd folded it carefully and put it in storage. Not thrown away. It had still been a real flag, a real symbol, even if the story attached to it was false. But it didn't belong in my living space anymore. I'd kept the urn too. Still didn't know whose ashes they were. Some other soldier. Someone who'd actually died while Rowan stole their identity. Eventually the army would figure out who and return them to their real family. But for now, they stayed with me. A reminder of what I'd believed. What I'd been told. What I'd grieved. I'd rebuilt my living room that weekend, rearranged furniture, changed the layout, made it look different than it had when Rowan's memory had anchored every corner. Not as a widow's space anymore. Just mine. I wasn't starting over. I'd done that 10 years ago when I'd believed Rowan was dead. I was just correcting the record. Living as a woman whose husband had left, not one whose husband had died. The distinction mattered. Rowan would go to prison. Maria would have to explain to Benton who his father really was. The life they'd built would collapse under the weight of truth. But those were their consequences, not my responsibility. I'd done my part, found the truth, documented it, set it in motion. Now I was just living. Not as a widow, not as someone defined by Rowan's absence, just as Alara Winslow, woman, professional, survivor, no longer tied to a ghost. The silence in my house felt different now. Not lonely, not haunted, just peaceful. And peace, I'd learned, was worth more than any lie ever told to preserve it.